There are farmers who solve problems with money, and farmers who solve them with scrap. Earl Maddox was the second type, and in the spring of 2011, he started burying steel beams from a demolished bridge in his wheat field in Rice County, Kansas. His neighbor, Walt Hatcher, called it a graveyard for junk. The county extension agent told Earl there was no research to support what he was doing and suggested he look into drip irrigation instead. Earl had a theory about what rust does to water underground, something he'd worked out from 40 years of watching fence posts corrode in Kansas clay. Didn't explain it to anyone, and he didn't stop digging. Earl Maddox was 61 years old, and he had been farming the same 600 acres in Rice County, Kansas, since his father handed him the keys to the machine shed in 1978. The land had been in the family since 1934, when his grandfather, Walter, staked a claim on a quarter section of prairie 20 miles west of Lyons and started breaking sod with a steel-walked plow and a team of horses. Walter survived the Dust Bowl on that ground. He watched the soil lift off in black clouds and settle in drifts against the fence lines, and he stayed, because there was nowhere else to go, and nothing else he knew how to do. Earl grew up on that land, and he understood it the way a mechanic understands an engine, not from books, but from the accumulated evidence of 40 years of working it with his hands. He ran 600 acres of hard red winter wheat and grain sorghum on a rotation his father had established and his grandfather had improvised. He planted with an International Harvester 1466, a tractor built in 1976 that still ran, because Earl rebuilt the engine himself every winter, timing the injectors by ear and seating the valves with a lapstone he'd inherited from his father. His combine was a Massey Ferguson 550 from the early 1982s, a machine he'd bought used in 1992 and maintained with parts he pulled from the boneyard behind the shed. He owned everything outright. The operation ran on cash and on the knowledge he carried in his hands, with no financed equipment, no operating line at the bank, and no telemetry screens in the cab. The problem was the soil. Rice County sits on a plain of silt loam over a clay subsoil, and decades of plowing at the same depth had formed a hardpan layer about 18 inches down. The hardpan was dense, mineral cemented, and nearly impermeable to water and roots both. In wet years the field ponded, the topsoil turning to soup that the wheat couldn't root through. In dry years the soil above the hardpan dried out and cracked, pulling apart in fissures that ran for yards across the surface, while the subsoil below stayed dry because the hardpan had blocked the water from reaching it in the first place. Roots hit the hardpan and turned sideways. The crop grew shallow, stressed, and vulnerable to every dry wind that came out of the south from June through August. Earl had watched it happen for 30 years. The same pattern, the same cracking, the same stunted wheat reaching for water that wasn't there, because a layer of compacted soil 18 inches down wouldn't let it through. Earl's neighbor, Walt Hatcher, farmed 800 acres on the other side of the county road and had installed a center pivot irrigation system on 200 of those acres in 2009. The pivot drew from a well tied to the Ogallala Aquifer, and the system had cost $140,000, financed through the Farm Credit System on a 7-year note. Walt's operating line ran $180,000 a year to cover fuel, seed, fertilizer, and the debt service on the pivot and his newer equipment. He ran a John Deere 8295R with an IVT transmission and a cab that tracked yield data through a monitor in the corner of the dashboard. Earl watched the pivot spray water across Walt's field and did the math in his head. The water, the pivot, the diesel to run it, and the debt service on all of it cost money he didn't want to spend. In a wet year, Walt's irrigated acres produced well enough to cover the note and leave a margin. In a dry year, the pivot ran longer, the well drew harder, the fuel bill climbed, and the margin shrank. Earl didn't want the debt. He wanted the land to hold its own water, the way it had before the hardpan formed, before decades of plowing had sealed the subsoil like a concrete floor under 6 inches of topsoil. But the hardpan wouldn't let it. The water that fell on Earl's field either evaporated, ran off, or sat on the surface until the sun took it. None of it reached the subsoil, where roots could find it in August. When the wind came out of the south and the temperature hung above 100 for days at a time, Earl needed a way to break the hardpan and create something underground that would hold water where the wheat could reach it. He didn't know what that something was yet, but he was thinking about it. Earl had been pulling fence posts out of the ground for as long as he'd been farming, and something about it had been bothering him for years. The posts always came out, rusted at the base, and the soil clinging to the rusted metal was always damp, not wet, not saturated, but damp in a way the dry soil a foot away wasn't. He'd pulled posts in August, in a drought, in ground that had cracked open, and the soil around the rusted steel at the bottom of the post hole was still holding moisture. He started thinking about it more deliberately in the winter of 2010. Rust is iron oxide, and iron oxide is porous. Porous materials hold water. A sponge holds water because it's full of tiny holes, and rust holds water the same way. The moisture pulled into the microscopic pores of the oxidized iron and held there as part of the material's structure. Earl hadn't read the chemistry journals that described this process, in terms of crystal lattices and hydrous iron oxide formations. He'd watched it happen at the bottom of a fence post hole for 40 years. He connected this to the hardpan problem over the course of a long winter. If he could bury something porous underground, below the hardpan layer, it would catch water as it percolated down through the soil and hold it there. The hardpan above would slow evaporation. The porous layer below would act as a reservoir keeping water in the subsoil, where roots could reach it during the dry months when the surface cracked and the wind stripped whatever moisture the topsoil had left. The material was already available. A bridge over Cow Creek on a county road east of Lyons had been demolished in 2010, and the county had left the steel I-beams and channel iron in a pile by the roadside. An old grain elevator in Lyons was being torn down too, the steel framing stacked in a lot waiting for a scrap hauler. Earl had his own boneyard behind the machine shed, broken plow frames, bent cultivator shanks, a cracked tractor, axle old pipe, rusted culvert sections. None of it was worth selling. All of it was steel. He did the math at the kitchen table with a pencil and the back of a feed tag. 40 acres, trenches every 30 feet, 3 feet wide, 4 feet deep. He needed roughly 60 tons of steel. The bridge pile alone had maybe 40 tons, and the grain elevator steel added another 30. Free for the hauling, the only cost being the trencher rental, the fuel for the truck, and his own time. He had no research to point to, no university study, no extension service bulletin. Just 40 years of watching rust hold water in Kansas clay, and a winter of thinking about what that might mean if someone buried enough of it in the right place. He decided to test it on his worst 40 acres, the section along the county road where the hardpan was thickest and the soil cracked deepest every summer. March 2011. Earl rented a tracked trencher from the Rice County Equipment Co-op, a Vermeer T758 that the co-op kept for drainage work and pipeline contractors. The rental ran $200 a day, and Earl figured he'd need it for 6 weeks. He could have used his own backhoe, but the trencher cut cleaner and faster. And at 61, he didn't have the patience for a bucket that moved 6 inches of dirt at a time. The first trench went in on the 14th of March, 4 feet deep, 3 feet wide, running the full length of the 40-acre section from the county road to the section line, a quarter mile of open earth. The trencher's teeth bit through the topsoil in the first 8 inches, and then hit the hardpan. The machine labored, the engine note dropping, as the carbide teeth ground through a dense mineral-cemented layer that threw off a fine powder, smelling of chalk, and hung in the air behind the cutter wheel. Earl's grandfather had broken sod on this ground with horses. The technology had changed, but the principle was the same. Get through the layer that stops everything. Below the hardpan, at about 30 inches, the soil changed to clay. Subsoil, dense and sticky when wet, hard as fired pottery when dry. Earl kept the trencher going to 48 inches because he wanted the steel below the hardpan, in the subsoil, where water would percolate if the hardpan weren't blocking it. The trencher dug through the clay in long, slow passes, the engine bogging on the thick sections, the tracks churning mud where the soil was wet enough to stick. He lined the bottom of the trench with steel I-beams from the bridge laid side by side across the width of the trench, then channel iron stacked on top of the beams, then smaller scrap filling the gaps. Broken plow frames, cultivator shanks, old pipe, the cracked tractor axle. The trench looked like a junkyard cross-section, a layered bed of rusted and rusting steel buried 3 feet below the surface. He covered it with 18 inches of the excavated soil and ran the trencher's tracks back over the filled trench to pack the surface level. The work took 6 weeks. 58 trenches, spaced 30 feet apart, running the full quarter-mile of the 40-acre section. 60 tons of steel, hauled in 40 loads with his 1979 Ford F700 grain truck, a vehicle that burned a quart of oil every 50 miles and needed transmission fluid every 3rd trip. Earl worked alone, dawn to dark. His wife Helen brought lunch to the field in a cooler and sat in the cab of the International while he ate, watching the trencher from the tractor seat, not saying much about the trenches. Walt Hatcher drove by on the county road in the 2nd week. He stopped, climbed out, and walked to the fence line. The conversation was short. "You're burying steel in your field." "That's what I'm doing." "What for?" "Holding water." Walt stood at the fence for another minute, watching the trencher grind through the hardpan. Then he said it, not shouting, but loud enough for Earl to hear over the engine. "You've lost your mind, Earl," Walt told 3 other neighbors. By the 3rd week, the 40 acres had become a roadside attraction. Farmers slowed down on the county road to look at the trenches, some stopping to walk to the fence, most just shaking their heads and driving on. One of them, a retired farmer named Dale Kruger, who'd sold his land in 2006, told Earl he was turning good farmland into a landfill. Earl didn't answer. He started the trencher and moved to the next trench line. The county extension agent, Ray Phelps, drove out in the 4th week. Ray was 38, had a master's in agronomy from Kansas State, and had been the Rice County extension agent for 6 years. He walked the field, examined the trenches, looked at the steel, and took notes on a clipboard. He told Earl there was no peer-reviewed research supporting buried metal as a water retention medium. He mentioned subsurface water retention technology, a system that used manufactured polyethylene membranes installed in trenches to slow water percolation through sandy soils. He mentioned the research backing the cost and the Kansas State soil testing program. He was polite about it, and he was certain. Earl listened. He didn't argue, didn't explain his theory about rust and fence post and porosity. When Ray finished, Earl started the trencher back up. In the 5th week, the trencher hit a buried rock layer at the east end of the section and sheared a carbide tooth off the cutter wheel. The tooth was a $180 replacement part, and the nearest one was at the Vermeer dealer in Hutchinson, 40 miles south. Earl lost a full day driving there and back, and the delay ate into his planting window. He had the wheat drilled by the 3rd week of April, 2 weeks later than he wanted, but in time. The trenches were done, the steel buried, and the waiting began, April 2011. Earl drilled hard red winter wheat on the 40 acres with a 30-foot grain drill pulled behind the International. The field looked the same as it always did from the road. The trenches were invisible, buried under 18 inches of packed soil, the surface smooth and unmarked. The crop came up evenly in the 2nd week of May, the young wheat breaking through in straight rows that gave no indication of what lay underneath. Below the surface, the chemistry had started. Rain fell in April and May, about 8 inches total, and water percolated down through the loosened soil above the trenches, past the broken hardpan, and reached the steel. Iron met oxygen and water, and the oxidation reaction began. Iron oxide started forming on the surface of every beam, every piece of channel iron, every broken plow shank, a slow and invisible process that was exactly what Earl was counting on. The science was straightforward. Rust is hydrous iron oxide. The chemical formula is Fe2O3 with a variable number of water molecules attached, written as NH2O in the textbooks. Those water molecules become part of the crystal structure of the rust itself, not sitting on the surface, but incorporated into the material. The rust doesn't just get wet. It holds water as part of what it is, the same way a sponge holds water in its pores, rather than on its surface. Iron oxide is also porous, with crystals 10 to 100 nanometers that aggregate into a matrix of microscopic pore spaces, filling with water and retaining it through the physical structure of the material itself. Soil scientists had documented this property for decades. Iron oxides in soil contribute to aggregate formation and stability, acting as binding agents that help soil particles clump together and create the pore space that holds water. Earl didn't know the literature. He knew fence posts, and he was betting 40 acres on what they'd taught him. He couldn't see any of it happening. He walked the field every morning before sunrise, checking the wheat, checking the soil, looking for something he couldn't name. In June, he dug a test hole with a shovel, 3 feet down, to the top of the first trench. The steel beams had a skin of orange-brown rust, thin but visible, flaking slightly where the shovel edge scraped the metal. The soil around the beams was darker than the clay he'd dug out 14 months earlier. He pushed his thumb into it, and the soil held the impression. He filled the hole back in and didn't tell anyone. The 2011 harvest on the 40 acres was average, not better or worse than expected. Earl had expected this, because the steel had only been in the ground for 6 months, and the rust layer was still thin. The porosity was just starting to develop, the water-holding capacity of the system still minimal. He planted the 40 acres again in the fall-winter wheat, and waited through the winter. The winter was dry. Snowfall ran below normal across central Kansas, and the spring rains in 2012 were sparse. By April, the weather stations in Hutchinson and Lyons were reporting rainfall 40% below the 30-year average. By May, the deficit was 60%. The forecast from the Climate Prediction Center called for above-normal temperatures and below-normal precipitation through the summer. Earl read the forecast and walked his field. The wheat was up, the rows straight, the surface unmarked. Underneath, the steel was still rusting, still developing, still holding whatever water reached it. But the water was getting scarce, and the sky wasn't offering more. June 2012. The drought intensified with a speed that surprised even the farmers who'd been watching the forecast for months. Temperatures in Rice County hit 108 degrees on the 15th of June and 112 on the 22nd of June. The last measurable precipitation had been the 28th of April, less than a quarter inch, and the forecast offered nothing but sun and wind. The U.S. Drought Monitor updated its map every Thursday, and every Thursday the dark red blob over the southern Great Plains grew. By the end of June, Rice County was rated severe drought, and the rating was climbing toward extreme. Walt Hatcher's center pivot system ran 18 hours a day on his 200 irrigated acres. The well drew from the Ogallala Aquifer, and the water table had been dropping for years as more pivots went in across the county, and the recharge couldn't keep pace with the pumping. Walt's pumping costs were climbing as the diesel to run the pivot hit $4.1 a gallon, and the system burned through 3 gallons an hour, 18 hours a day, for a field that was still stressed because the heat was evaporating the water faster than the pivot could lay it down. Walt was pouring money and water into the ground and watching both disappear into the sky. The dryland fields, the ones without irrigation, started cracking by the second week of June, and the hardpan compounded the damage. The surface split first, pulling apart in jagged fissures that opened to 2 inches wide and ran for yards across the bare dirt. Below the hardpan, the subsoil was dry too, because the hardpan wouldn't let what little rain had fallen through to it. There was nothing to hold moisture anywhere in the profile. The water that fell in April was gone, evaporated from the surface, or run off into the ditch along the county road. By the first week of July, Walt's dryland section, the 600 acres without the pivot, was cracking open in fissures wide enough to stick a hand into. The wheat was stunted, the heads not filling, the kernels shriveling on the stalk. Walt would harvest 14 bushels an acre where he normally pulled 45, which at $7.8 a bushel came to $109 an acre in revenue, against $85 in input costs. He was losing money on every acre, and the irrigated acres weren't much better, because the cost of keeping them alive was eating the margin. Earl watched his neighbor's fields crack from the cab of the International as he drove the section roads. Then he drove past his own 40 acres, the ones with the steel underneath, and slowed down. The wheat was shorter than normal, stressed by the heat and the lack of rain. But it was green, and it wasn't the pale, desperate green of a crop hanging on by its roots. It was a darker green, the color of wheat that has water available to it, even in a drought. The heads were filling, not full or lush, but present, with kernels forming small but viable, in a year when most of the dryland wheat in Rice County had already given up. He dug another test hole in the second week of July, 4 feet down, through the packed fill, through the broken hardpan, down to the steel. The I-beams were rusted now, a thick rough crust of orange-brown iron oxide covering every surface, the kind of rust that builds over years of exposure to moisture and oxygen in the soil. The soil was wet, not muddy or saturated, but damp enough to hold together when he squeezed it in his fist. The subsoil around the steel was darker than the clay he remembered digging out 15 months earlier, stained with iron oxide, and it was holding water that every other field in Rice County had lost to evaporation and runoff months ago. The 40 acres yielded 31 bushels an acre. It wasn't a great harvest by any standard, but in a year when the county average for dryland wheat was 11 bushels, 31 was 3 times what anyone else harvested without irrigation. Earl's revenue ran $241 an acre at $7.8 a bushel. His input costs were $62 an acre, with no irrigation, no debt service, no pivot payment. He cleared $179 an acre on the 40-42. Walt's dryland, 600, cleared negative $24 an acre. The numbers didn't need interpretation. In the last week of July, a heat wave pushed temperatures to 115 degrees for 5 straight days. Earl's wheat, already stressed and shortened by the drought, started showing burn on the leaf tips. He walked the field at dawn every morning, checking every section, looking for the point where the stored water would run out and the crop would fail. The 40 acres held. The leaf burn stopped at the tips, the kernel stayed in the heads, and the crop didn't fail. But it was close, closer than Earl would tell anyone, and he walked those rows at 4 in the morning with the flashlight on his phone, counting kernels and doing the math on how much water the steel had left to give. August 2012. The drought was national news. Rice County was designated a primary disaster area by the USDA, and crop insurance claims were flooding into the Farm Service Agency office in Lyons. The county average for dryland wheat was the lowest since 1956, and Earl's 31 bushels an acre was an outlier that no one in the county could explain, at least not publicly. The cracks kept spreading outward across the county in a network of fissures that followed the soil's natural fracture lines, and by mid-August they had reached the county road between Earl's 40 acres and Walt's field. The cracks cross the road, they enter Earl's field, they split the dry surface soil in the same jagged patterns, the same 2-inch fissures, the same evidence of a soil profile that has surrendered its moisture to the wind and the heat. But when the cracks reach the trench lines, they stop. Instead of running straight through the field, they curve, following the line of buried steel, bending around the trenches like water around a stone. The soil above the trenches is packed and stable, held together by the structure of the buried steel underneath, and the cracks can't break through it. A crack opens along the fence line where Earl's 40 acres meets the county road. It opens wider than the others, 3 inches across, and it goes deep. A foot down, it hits the edge of the first trench, the one Earl dug on the 14th of March, 2011. And there, visible through the fissure in the earth, is a rusted steel I-beam sitting in dark, damp soil. Walt Hatcher is the first person to see it. He's driving past on the 18th of August, checking his own fence line, and he stops where the crack has opened the soil along Earl's boundary. He looks down into the fissure. A rusted I-beam sits in dark earth, visible through the crack. Next is the rust itself, a thick orange-brown crust covering the steel. The damp soil clings to it dark and wet, in a field where every other clump of earth within a mile is bone dry and cracking apart. Walt stands at the fence for a long time. He doesn't say anything to Earl that day. He drives home. But by the end of the week, half the county has heard about the steel in Earl's field, the scrap that everyone had laughed at, sitting in wet earth while the ground around it cracked. September 2012. Earl harvested the 40 acres. 31 bushels an acre, confirmed by the yield monitor on the grain cart, which was the one piece of modern technology Earl tolerated because it didn't require a subscription or a dealer password, WELBA. The rest of his dryland acreage, the 560 acres, without steel underneath, averaged 9 bushels. The contrast between the 40 and the rest of his own operation was as stark as the contrast between Earl's 40 and Walt's dryland. The steel was the variable. Everything else was the same soil, the same seed, the same rainfall, the same drought. Walt Hatcher came to Earl's farm on a Saturday in late September. He parked his truck by the machine shed and walked to where Earl was cleaning the grain drill with an air compressor and a shop rag. He didn't apologize. He didn't mention the jokes, the phone calls to other neighbors, the time he'd told Earl he'd lost his mind. He asked one question: "How does it work?" Earl explained it the way he understood it. The steel rusts. Rust holds water. The water stays in the ground instead of running off or evaporating. The hard pan above the trenches is broken up so roots can get through to the water below. It's not complicated, just took someone willing to try it. Walt listened. He asked about the cost, and Earl told him $200 a day for 6 weeks of trencher rental, the diesel for the grain truck, and his own labor. About $4,800 total for 40 acres. Walt had spent $140,000 on his center pivot system in 2009, not counting the annual operating costs that ran into the tens of thousands every year. Earl's one-time cost for the steel was less than what Walt spent on pivot diesel in a single drought month. Ray Phelps came back in October and took soil samples from 3 trench lines and 3 control sites, sending them to the testing lab at Kansas State. The results came back in November. The soil around the buried steel showed higher moisture retention, improved aggregate stability, and measurable iron oxide content compared to the control samples. The lab report was 3 pages of data tables and a summary paragraph. Ray wrote a brief piece for the Extension Service newsletter, 400 words noting the findings and suggesting further study. It ran in the December issue. It didn't make waves. 2 neighbors hauled scrap steel from a demolished dairy barn outside Sterling and buried it in test strips on their own fields in the fall of 2012. Earl didn't charge them, didn't patent anything, didn't write a paper. He told them what he'd done and let them watch the results for themselves. One of them, a wheat farmer named Carl Phelps, no relation to the extension agent, put in 10 acres of trenches and waited for the next dry year to see what would happen. But Earl was 61 years old, and he had no children farming the land. His son Tom lived in Wichita, worked in commercial insurance, and had no interest in 600 acres of Kansas wheat ground. Tom had left for college in 1988 and come back twice a year, at Thanksgiving and after harvest, and the land was something he respected but didn't want. The knowledge Earl carried, the thing he'd worked out from watching fence posts rust, existed in his head and in the ground. Nowhere else. What Earl did wasn't new in principle. The idea of burying a barrier underground to slow water percolation had been studied since the 1960 seconds when researchers tried packing trenches with clay and asphalt to create subsurface water retention in sandy soils. Yeomans had developed keyline design in Australia in the 1950 seconds, a system of subsoil ripping that broke hardpan and improved water infiltration, using a specialized chisel plow that loosened a subsoil without inverting it. The Yeomans plow was still manufactured 60 years later. The concept was old, documented, and available to anyone willing to read a book. What changed was the solution. Modern agronomy had moved toward manufactured systems. Subsurface water retention technology meant polyethylene membranes engineered to last 50 years, installed with specialized trench digging machines that cost more than Earl's entire operation. Precision irrigation meant soil moisture sensors, variable rate controllers, and telemetry systems that transmitted data to a phone. Center pivot systems meant six-figure investments and financing through the farm credit system. Each solution worked, each had peer-reviewed research behind it, and each cost money, required financing, and created a dependency on manufacturers, dealers, and banks that a farmer with a paid-off tractor and a pile of bridge steel didn't carry. Earl's solution cost $4,800 and 60 tons of scrap metal that the county had left by the roadside. The science was the same. Create a subsurface layer that holds water in the root zone. Break the hardpan so roots can reach it. The difference was the material. One came from a factory and required a dealer network. The other came from a demolition pile and required a truck and a willingness to look foolish in front of his neighbors for 6 weeks. The question that Earl's story raised wasn't whether the method worked, because the 31 bushels an acre and the damp soil around the rusted steel had already answered that. The question was why the knowledge that a farmer could use scrap iron and a rented trencher had been left behind, while the knowledge that a farmer could use manufactured membranes and a specialized installation machine became the only version with research backing and extension service approval. Who benefits when the cheap solution is forgotten and the expensive one is the only one the county agent will recommend? Earl didn't ask that question, wasn't the type, and just dug. Spring 2013. Earl planted the 40 acres again. The steel was still there, rusting deeper, the iron oxide crust thickening with every rain that percolated through the broken hardpan and reached the buried beams. The green came up in straight rows, the same as always, giving no sign of what was underneath. Earl walked the field at dawn, alone the way his grandfather had walked it 80 years earlier, checking the wheat by feel and by sight. The iron was underground, the water was underground, the knowledge was in one man's hands and one man's ground, and whether anyone else would dig for it was a question the land couldn't answer.